The moment the news reached Eisenhower's headquarters, a ripple of tension swept through the room like an electric current. Officers who had spent months navigating the rigid structures of military hierarchy now found themselves suspended in disbelief. The map on the table, once a meticulous representation of coordinated maneuvers, was marred by jagged streaks of lines, marking the audacious advance of Patton's Third Army. Every commander in the room instinctively understood the implications. A massive force of armored tanks, artillery, and infantry had crossed the Rhine, completely bypassing the carefully drafted orders from Supreme Headquarters. 50,000 German troops were now trapped, their lines shattered and the front in flux, all because one man had chosen to act, not wait. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. Some were awestruck, others silently horrified. "He's doing it again," muttered one, a young captain barely out of training, his voice betraying both fear and admiration. Another shook his head, muttering, "This is insubordination on a scale I've never seen." Whispered debates flitted across the room, fragmented sentences of disbelief mingling with awe. The aura of rigidity that had defined the staff meeting for months suddenly seemed brittle, almost fragile, in the face of raw, uncontained action. Eisenhower remained seated at the head of the table, his posture deceptively relaxed, yet his mind worked at a speed that outpaced any observer in the room. He didn't need to read the reports to understand the stakes. They were already etched on the faces of his staff. He watched silently as men debated, hesitated, and sought clarity. For a moment, the room seemed suspended in an almost surreal stillness, the air thick with tension. Then he spoke, his voice calm, precise, and resonant, cutting through the murmurs like a blade through fog. "Gentlemen," he began, the weight of command resting on every syllable, "history is rarely shaped by caution. It is shaped by those who dare to act when the rest of us hesitate." The statement was both a balm and a jolt. Officers leaned forward, unsure whether to brace for reprimand or to absorb praise. The young captain who had spoken before straightened, eyebrows raised, uncertain of the tone he was meant to take. Eisenhower, sensing the collective anxiety, gestured toward the map. "Look here," he said, pointing at the chaotic lines that sliced across the Rhine. "This is more than just movement on a chart. This is audacity. This is foresight." Patton didn't wait for approval. He created opportunity. And in doing so, he has rewritten the operational landscape in a single decisive stroke. A murmur ran through the room. Officers began examining the map with renewed intensity, tracing the path of armored columns, imagining the lightning strikes of artillery and the precise timing of infantry movements. Each line represented not just movement, but risk, enormous, calculated risk that could have ended in catastrophic failure. And yet, it hadn't. Patton had leveraged speed, surprise, and sheer audacity to bend the course of the battle in favor of the Allies. The room was silent now, the earlier anxiety replaced by a strange reverence, the kind that arises when ordinary men witness extraordinary courage. Eisenhower leaned back in his chair, interlacing his fingers behind his head, a rare moment of contemplative stillness. He had always known that Patton was fearless, a man whose boldness bordered on recklessness, but this act transcended even his expectations. Patton's decision to cross the Rhine without orders was more than insubordination. It was a calculated gamble that exposed him to enemy fire, logistical chaos, and the potential wrath of the Supreme Command. Yet here he was, succeeding where caution would have only preserved the status quo. Eisenhower's mind raced through the implications. The German forces, previously confident in their ability to hold the Western Front, were now destabilized. Entire divisions were at risk of encirclement. The speed and decisiveness of this maneuver could shorten the campaign in ways that months of planning never could. He spoke again, his tone now measured, almost philosophical, yet imbued with an unmistakable intensity. Gentlemen, we are confronted with a paradox. Patton has broken every rule we hold sacred. He has defied orders. He has bypassed coordination. And yet, he has delivered results that no strategy committee could have dreamed of achieving. This is the essence of leadership under fire. This is what differentiates those who command from those who merely follow. Some officers nodded slowly, their initial fear giving way to reluctant admiration. Others remained tense, their military instincts still grappling with the concept that success could justify disobedience. The debate, though silent, was palpable. Every man in that room had been trained to value chain of command above all else, yet here they were, witnessing a man bending and even breaking the rules and succeeding spectacularly. It was a lesson as profound as any learned in the battlefield. Audacity, when combined with skill and vision, could achieve what strict adherence to orders never could. Eisenhower continued, pacing now, his hands clasped behind his back. Patton has always been a man of action. He sees the battlefield as a living organism, and he responds instinctively. Where we see protocols and procedure, he sees opportunity. Where we see risk, he sees possibility. This is why he is invaluable to the Allied effort. And yes, he added, almost as if reading the thoughts of the room, it frightens us, because it reminds us of what can be achieved when one trusts instinct over instruction. He paused at the large window that overlooked the sprawling headquarters, the twilight casting long shadows across the war maps and documents scattered about. Look closely at the Rhine. It is no longer just a river, he said, his voice lowering with gravitas. It is a symbol of what can be done when courage meets timing. Patton's forces have not merely crossed a physical barrier, they have crossed the threshold of possibility, and they have done so at a moment when hesitation would have been fatal. A younger officer, his face pale but determined, finally spoke up. Sir, forgive me, but isn't this dangerous? He could have been destroyed. He disobeyed direct orders. There was a tremor of fear in his voice, the voice of someone still learning the fine line between bravery and foolhardiness. Eisenhower turned slowly, locking eyes with the officer, and for a brief moment the room seemed to hold its collective breath. Then he smiled faintly, a smile that conveyed understanding, experience, and an acknowledgement of the risk involved. Yes, Eisenhower said quietly, almost softly, he could have been, and yet he wasn't. Why? Because brilliance often masquerades as recklessness. Leadership is not always about following orders. Sometimes it is about seeing the moment clearly, understanding the enemy's weakness, and taking decisive action when the opportunity presents itself. Patton embodies that clarity. And make no mistake, what you see here is not luck. It is skill, audacity, and relentless drive executed to perfection. The murmurs in the room shifted. Fear and tension gave way to a complicated mix of admiration, disbelief, and inspiration. The officers leaned over the map again, tracing the route of tanks, infantry, and supply convoys. Each movement, each choice, represented a calculated risk that could have resulted in annihilation. Yet here it was, victory in motion. Eisenhower's words had transformed anxiety into understanding, hesitation into a cautious kind of excitement. They were witnessing the raw power of initiative, the way one man's decision could alter the course of entire campaigns and even reshape history itself. He straightened, placing his hands on the map, pressing down lightly as if to anchor the chaotic lines in reality. Patton doesn't wait, he said. He acts. He doesn't debate endlessly. He doesn't let fear or protocol paralyze him. And that, he emphasized, his voice rising with conviction, is why the Rhine is crossed today and why history will remember this moment long after we are gone. Opportunity, when recognized and seized, becomes action. Action, when guided by skill and courage, becomes triumph. And try, Oomph, gentlemen, is what shapes the world. The young captain swallowed hard, realizing that the lesson he had been taught about obedience and procedure, while invaluable, was only one part of leadership. Here was proof that vision and courage could sometimes outweigh the weight of command structure. The older officers, hardened by years of war, nodded slowly, their minds replaying campaigns, battles, and operations where hesitation had cost lives and territory. Now, here was a counterpoint, a man who had taken a gamble and won, creating opportunity out of chaos and shaping the battlefield in ways that protocol alone could never have achieved. For hours, they debated quietly among themselves, but Eisenhower's calm, commanding presence provided the anchor. Every question, every hesitation was met not with anger, but with perspective, an understanding of both the risks and the rewards. They began to see that Patton's crossing of the Rhine was not merely a bold military maneuver, it was a lesson in the art of leadership, in understanding the unpredictable nature of war, and in embracing action when the moment demanded it. As night fell over the European theater, the rooms slowly emptied, officers leaving with a mix of awe and trepidation. Eisenhower remained behind, alone, his gaze fixed on the map. The streaks marking Patton's advance glowed faintly under the lamplight, a testament to audacity, vision, and the unpredictable genius that sometimes walks hand in hand with recklessness. He knew that the world outside these walls would debate the crossing, the risk, and the audacity. Some would call it insubordination, others, genius. But in that quiet moment, Eisenhower understood the truth. History was being made, and it was being made by a man unafraid to act, unbound by caution, and driven by an unyielding sense of purpose. And in that knowledge, he felt a rare surge of certainty, a certainty that boldness, when tempered with skill, could change the world. The Rhine had been crossed, and the battlefield had been forever altered. History would remember this night not for the orders ignored, but for the courage seized. Eisenhower rose from his chair, a deliberate motion that commanded attention, and began pacing slowly along the length of the war room. The map, still sprawled across the table, bore the chaotic testament of Patton's audacious advance, and the officers around him shifted uneasily as he moved. The quiet, tense hum that had filled the room earlier seemed to settle into a heavier, almost oppressive anticipation. Every eye was fixed on the Supreme Commander, waiting for the judgment that could sway the course of their own reputations and, by extension, the trajectory of the war. He stopped, pivoting slightly so that his back was to the window, but his gaze seemed to pierce the entire headquarters. "We stand at a crossroads," he said, voice measured but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Do we chastise him for disobedience? Do we cling to protocol and bureaucratic propriety, and thereby risk stifling the initiative that has just handed us a tremendous advantage? Or do we recognize, despite the discomfort it brings, that genius sometimes appears in the guise of rebellion?" The words struck the room like a thunderclap. Officers instinctively straightened, the younger ones leaning forward with wide-eyed uncertainty. The older men exchanged subtle nods, their hardened faces betraying a mix of admiration and apprehension. Eisenhower's question was not merely rhetorical, it demanded reflection, moral courage, and strategic foresight from every officer present. He began to pace again, slower this time, his hands clasped behind his back. Patton does not measure his actions against manuals or regulations. He measures them against opportunity. That is why he is unparalleled in this war. He sees what others cannot see. He moves where others would hesitate, and he strikes with a decisiveness that reshapes the battlefield. His gaze swept over the faces of his staff, each man feeling the weight of the statement. It was a declaration, a warning, and a lesson all at once. A murmur rippled through the room, subdued but undeniable. The younger officers fidgeted nervously, their military conditioning clashing with the instinctive recognition of brilliance. One of the senior aides, a brigadier general known for his meticulous attention to procedure, cleared his throat. "Sir, "Forgive my candor," he began carefully, "but while we may celebrate the results, the act itself, crossing the Rhine without orders, could have ended in disaster. Entire divisions might have been annihilated. Should we not consider that?" Eisenhower stopped mid-step, turning slowly to face the general. His expression was calm, yet his eyes conveyed the sharp, assessing gaze of a man who had seen the fog of war and understood its paradoxes. "Yes," he said quietly, almost as if in contemplation, "it could have ended in disaster. That is precisely what makes this achievement remarkable. Leadership, true leadership, is not about avoiding risk. It is about understanding it, weighing it, and acting decisively when opportunity and timing align." The room fell silent. Officers absorbed the meaning of his words, some nodding slowly, others still processing the audacity it implied. Eisenhower's calm authority and his refusal to condemn Patton outright transformed the anxiety in the room into a kind of sober reflection. Every officer realized that history was not written solely by obedience, but also by courage and vision, by men willing to act when hesitation would have doomed the effort. He moved to the map, spreading his hands over the sprawling front. "Observe the positions of the German divisions," he said, tracing with his finger the fragmented lines. "They are scrambling, disoriented. Their supply chains are collapsing under the pressure of Patton's advance. A single bold maneuver has turned the tide in this sector, and yet we must understand that it was not luck. It was foresight, speed, and audacity executed with precision." A younger officer, barely out of training, raised his voice, tinged with both fear and curiosity. "Sir, how do we reconcile this with discipline, with command structure? If every general acted as he did, we would have chaos." Eisenhower's eyes softened slightly, a mixture of empathy and teaching present in his gaze. He walked closer to the young man, stopping so that their eyes met. "Discipline is essential," he said, "but so is judgment. Rules exist to guide, not to imprison. There are moments when the battlefield itself dictates the course of action, and the man who can interpret it with clarity is the one who changes history. Patton has that clarity." He stepped back, turning to address the entire room. "From this moment onward, the Rhine is more than a river. It is a symbol, a testament to courage, speed, and decisive action. Patton's crossing is not merely a military maneuver, it is a lesson in initiative, a demonstration that sometimes the chains of protocol must yield to the immediacy of opportunity, and we, as leaders, must recognize that wisdom." The officers leaned in, their minds racing. They could see the implications, not just strategically but philosophically. Patton's act challenged everything they had been trained to believe about war, obedience, and command. It forced them to consider that genius might operate outside the boundaries of convention, and that fear, when combined with action, could transform hesitation into decisive advantage. Eisenhower's pacing slowed, and he stopped again at the table. "We have all spent months planning, coordinating, ensuring that every movement is synchronized, that every order is adhered to. And yet," he said, lifting his gaze to each officer, "one man has acted outside those plans and created an effect no committee of strategists could have achieved. This is the paradox of leadership. It demands adherence to order, but it also demands the courage to act when the moment compels it." A senior colonel, his brow furrowed, finally ventured another thought. "Sir, but what of accountability? If this had failed, if Patton's forces had been crushed, would history have judged him so kindly?" Eisenhower's lips curved into a faint, wry smile, and he shook his head. "No," he said. "History is rarely kind to failure regardless of intent. But we are not historians. We are commanders. Our task is to recognize potential and act in a way that maximizes it. Patton understood that, and today, the results speak for themselves." He moved to the window, staring out over the horizon where the last light of day faded into the darkness of night. "We must not confuse boldness with recklessness," he continued. "There is a fine line, and it is walked only by those with vision, experience, and courage. Patton has walked it, and he has crossed safely to the other side, reshaping the battlefield in the process. That is why he is invaluable. The young officer who had questioned him earlier nodded slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing. For the first time, he began to grasp the complexity of command, the interplay of risk and opportunity, and the rare genius required to act decisively in moments of uncertainty. The older officers, veterans of campaigns that had cost countless lives, understood the gravity of Eisenhower's words. They saw in the crossing not just audacity, but the embodiment of everything a military leader should aspire to: intuition, decisiveness, and the courage to bear responsibility for outcomes that cannot be predicted. Eisenhower turned back to the map, tracing the lines once more. "Consider the German response," he said. "Their coordination is fractured. Their command is in disarray. And this is all because one man had the foresight to act before the enemy could adapt. We must learn from this, not to imitate recklessness, but to understand the principles that guided it: clarity, timing, audacity, and relentless execution." A whisper ran through the room as officers exchanged looks. They were beginning to internalize the lesson, not just about Patton, but about leadership itself. Eisenhower's calm authority, his refusal to panic, and his ability to frame the situation in both strategic and philosophical terms transformed a moment of potential chaos into a teaching moment of unparalleled significance. He raised his hand, signaling for silence. "This is what I want you to remember," he said, voice firm yet reflective. "Leadership is not just about following orders. It is about interpreting the battlefield, understanding the enemy, and taking decisive action when the opportunity arises. Patton has done that tonight, and in doing so, he has not only advanced our position, he has reshaped our understanding of what is possible." The room fell silent, the officers absorbing the weight of his words. The tension had not entirely dissipated, but it had transformed into a sober appreciation for the unpredictable nature of warfare and the rare individuals who could bend it to their will. Each officer realized that they had witnessed a moment that would be studied for decades, a moment where the audacity of one man had altered the course of history. Eisenhower stepped back from the map, clasping his hands behind his back once more. "Remember," he said, his voice low but carrying across the room, "the battlefield is a living, breathing entity. It cannot be controlled solely by plans and orders. It must be understood, respected, and acted upon with clarity and courage. Patton has done this, and we must learn from it, even as we marvel at it." The officers remained still, the lesson sinking deep. The crossing of the Rhine had created ripples that extended far beyond the immediate tactical advantage. It had reshaped their understanding of leadership, initiative, and the interplay of risk and reward. Eisenhower, standing alone by the window now, allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He understood that the story of this crossing would be told for generations, not for the orders ignored, but for the audacity, clarity, and skill that had made success inevitable. And in that quiet moment, as night fully descended over the European theater, Eisenhower knew that boldness, guided by vision and courage, was often the true catalyst for victory. Patton had acted outside the lines, and the world would never forget it. By the time night had fully fallen over the European theater, Eisenhower sat alone at his desk, the soft glow of a lamp illuminating the map before him. Reports continued to arrive, each one more astonishing than the last, detailing the rapid and unrelenting advance of Patton's forces. The Third Army had not merely crossed the Rhine. They had shattered the German lines, leaving entire divisions disoriented, their communications severed, and their supplies in chaos. For the first time in months, Eisenhower allowed himself a rare moment of contemplative awe. He knew that what had been accomplished was unprecedented, and yet he also understood that it came with a weighty responsibility. The room was silent, the only sound the occasional rustle of papers and the faint hum of distant activity from the staff still at work in adjacent rooms. Eisenhower leaned back, hands clasped behind his head, and allowed his mind to retrace the events of the day. The audacity of Patton's maneuver, the sheer speed and decisiveness with which he had acted, left a profound impression. 50,000 German troops were effectively trapped, and entire strategic plans had unraveled within hours. But it was more than numbers and positions. It was the undeniable demonstration of initiative, of the extraordinary potential that emerges when courage intersects with opportunity. He thought back to the earlier staff meetings, the tension, the murmurs of disbelief and concern. Officers had questioned the wisdom of Patton's insubordination, fretted over the risk, and debated the implications for military discipline. And yet, in every report that reached him now, the proof of Patton's brilliance was undeniable. Eisenhower understood the delicate balance he had to strike, to recognize and harness this brilliance without undermining the structure of command that underpinned the entire Allied operation. It was a paradox he had faced many times, but never so starkly as now. Eisenhower rose and began to pace slowly, his eyes tracing the path of Patton's advance across the map. He considered the decisions made, the split-second judgments, the calculated risks. Every tank, every battalion movement, every artillery strike had been executed with precision, yet without direct orders. It was a symphony of chaos orchestrated by a single mind attuned to the rhythm of the battlefield. This, he muttered to himself, is the difference between a commander and a leader. One follows instructions, the other shapes history. The room remained empty, but he could almost hear the echoes of the debates that had filled it hours earlier. He remembered the questions, the doubts, the insistence on procedure, and contrasted it with the unfolding reality, a decisive victory created through bold, unconventional action. Eisenhower recognized that this moment would be dissected for years to come by historians, military theorists, and students of leadership. They would study the crossing of the Rhine, marvel at the audacity, and attempt to replicate it, often without understanding the unique confluence of vision, timing, and courage that had made it possible. He returned to his chair, leaning over the map once more, eyes scanning the positions and lines that represented more than just geography. They were the lifeblood of the campaign, the tangible outcomes of human decision and action. The reports had detailed German units attempting to regroup, their attempts increasingly desperate and disorganized. Entire command structures had been rendered ineffective, and supply lines were collapsing under the relentless pressure of Patton's advance. It was as if the battlefield itself had been reshaped overnight by the decisive action of one man. Eisenhower reflected on the paradox of leadership. Patton had broken rules, defied orders, and yet the results could not be questioned. This was the essence of command under the pressure of war, to recognize that sometimes the prescribed path is not the correct one, and that the courage to act decisively can produce outcomes far beyond what careful planning could achieve. It was a lesson that resonated deeply with Eisenhower, who had spent years navigating the tension between military discipline and the unpredictable realities of the battlefield. He recalled the moment when the first reports arrived, the anxious faces of his staff, the uncertainty in the debates. There had been fear, real, palpable fear, of what could have gone wrong, and yet, as the situation developed, the fear had been replaced by a cautious admiration, a recognition that boldness, when guided by clarity and skill, could transform not only the immediate tactical landscape, but the very course of a campaign. Eisenhower understood that this was not just a victory of maneuver or logistics, but a triumph of human judgment, courage, and decisiveness. He paused, allowing himself to imagine the scene at the front. Patton's tanks, rolling across the Rhine, artillery firing with precision, infantry advancing in perfect coordination, all moving faster than the enemy could react. The chaos of battle, the smoke, the thunder of engines and shells, and yet the underlying order, the clarity of purpose, was what made the difference. Eisenhower admired the audacity, the speed, and the sheer decisiveness that had created this situation. It was a lesson in leadership writ large, that sometimes to win, one must act before orders are given, guided by vision rather than instruction. A quiet knock at the door broke his reverie. A young aide entered, carrying the latest telegrams from the front. Eisenhower gestured for him to place them on the desk. Each one confirmed the unfolding reality: German units in disarray, supply lines disrupted, and entire divisions effectively neutralized. The reports were precise, factual, and yet they could not capture the essence of what had happened, the human element, the courage, the audacity that had changed the battlefield. Eisenhower reviewed each message carefully, noting the operational details, the strengths and weaknesses exposed, and the opportunities now available for further exploitation. He leaned back, reflecting on the broader implications. Patton's action had not only achieved immediate tactical success, but had also shifted the strategic momentum of the campaign. The German command, previously confident in its ability to stabilize the front, was now forced into reactive measures, improvisation, and retreat. The initiative had passed entirely into Allied hands, and the psychological impact on both sides would be profound. Morale, confidence, and perception, the intangible factors that shape warfare, had all been influenced decisively by one man's bold decision. Eisenhower's thoughts turned inward. As a commander, he had always valued discipline, order, and coordination. These principles had guided the Allied strategy for months and had been instrumental in achieving consistent progress. Yet, in this moment, he recognized that the principles themselves were not sufficient. The unpredictable nature of warfare demanded flexibility, insight, and the willingness to act decisively in the face of uncertainty. Patton had embodied these qualities in a way that no one else could, and the results spoke for themselves. He returned his gaze to the map, imagining the next moves, the adjustments required, and the opportunities that had been created. Every officer, every soldier, every resource now had to be aligned to capitalize on the momentum that Patton had generated. Eisenhower knew that this would require careful coordination, strategic foresight, and clear communication, but also trust in the initiative of those under his command. The Rhine had been crossed, but the campaign was far from over. Success now depended on the ability to maintain pressure, exploit weaknesses, and anticipate the enemy's response. Eisenhower's reflections were interrupted by a soft knock once more. This time, a senior aide entered hesitantly. "Sir," he said, "the staff awaits your final word." Eisenhower gestured for them to come in, and slowly, officers filed into the room, their faces a mixture of exhaustion, awe, and anticipation. They had witnessed history in the making, and now they awaited guidance on how to interpret it, how to act, and how to incorporate the lessons of Patton's bold maneuver into the broader strategy. Eisenhower stood facing his staff. The room was silent, every eye on him. He spoke deliberately, his words measured, precise, and resonant with authority. "Gentlemen, tonight we have witnessed a rare and extraordinary demonstration of leadership. Patton has crossed the Rhine without orders, and in doing so, he has reshaped the battlefield, disrupted the enemy, and created opportunities that we could not have imagined. This is a moment that will be studied, debated, and remembered." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the room. "Remember this. History does not honor those who merely follow instructions. It honors those who act decisively when the moment demands it. Leadership is not simply about obedience. It is about vision, courage, and the ability to seize opportunity. Patton has demonstrated all three in abundance. A young officer, emboldened, asked, "Sir, what should our next steps be?" Eisenhower's eyes swept over the room, conveying both confidence and expectation. "Our next steps," he said, "are to consolidate, to capitalize, and to maintain momentum. We must ensure that the gains achieved are not squandered by hesitation or overcaution. We must act decisively, just as Patton did, but with the clarity and coordination that the larger strategy requires. And above all, we must remember the lesson he has taught us. Audacity, when guided by skill and purpose, can achieve what caution alone never could." The room remained silent, officers absorbing the profound implications of his words. Eisenhower allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He understood that the crossing of the Rhine was not simply a tactical victory. It was a defining moment in the campaign, a demonstration of the human elements that underpin warfare: courage, decisiveness, insight, and the ability to act in the face of uncertainty. It was a lesson that transcended the battlefield, one that would shape the approach of commanders for years to come. Finally, Eisenhower returned to his desk, reviewing the latest communications from the front. Each report confirmed the unfolding reality. The German command was in disarray, the Rhine had been crossed, and the initiative now rested firmly with the Allies. He allowed himself a faint, satisfied smile. History had been made, and the men who had acted with audacity had changed the course of events. As the night deepened and the headquarters settled into a quiet vigil, Eisenhower reflected on the paradox of leadership and the unpredictable nature of warfare. Boldness, skill, and decisiveness had triumphed, and the consequences would resonate far beyond this night. Patton's crossing of the Rhine would be remembered not for the orders ignored, but for the courage, clarity, and audacity that made success inevitable. In that moment, Eisenhower knew that the true engine of history was not adherence to procedure alone, but the rare combination of vision, action, and the willingness to bear responsibility for outcomes that cannot be predicted. And with that understanding, he leaned back, letting the weight of the day settle, knowing that the Allies had not only gained a strategic victory, but had witnessed the raw power of leadership in its most terrifying and brilliant form. The Rhine had been crossed, the battle was won, and history, as always, would remember the bold,